All right. We're thrilled to be here with you today to talk about best practices for digital collection development. And we're going to, try and cover a lot of ground in a relatively short period of time relating to the selection process and specific selection criteria for why you may want to include or may not want to include some of your holdings in a digital collection. Before we go too much farther, let's introduce ourselves a little bit. Melissa, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Sure, thank you. So I'm Melissa Jerome, and I work in the Latin American and Caribbean collection here at the University of Florida Libraries as the digital initiatives librarian for this collection. And I will say, to not give you a full-blown bio, just something very brief, I'm primarily focusing right now on digitizing collections and enhancing our digital collections in DLOC as well. So working with DLOC on a daily basis. And I see some familiar faces. So hello to those that I met last month.
Thanks, Melissa. And I am the curator of our Panama Canal Museum collection here at the University of Florida. I also work closely with our Latin American Caribbean collection and a few other areas here in the Department of Special and Area Studies collections. Like Melissa, I'm on the DLOC revitalizing grant that Kat was just telling you about. And I've had many digital projects in the past that I have been a part of, either as a PI on a grant, for example, or as part of a team putting together digital projects. All right. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about, it's going to be an overview of collection development. And specifically, the way we've divided this up is that Melissa is going to begin by talking about the selection process in general. She's going to cover some of the things you see there on the slide relating to format and permissions and funding, that kind of thing. And then I'm going to come back behind Melissa and I'm going to drill down a little bit farther and make sure that we cover give some examples and give some a little bit more in depth on some of the areas that Melissa is going to introduce you to. So some of it's going to be a little bit repetitive in that sense that you'll hear some things twice, but with this kind of stuff, it's probably good to hear it twice. And as Kat mentioned earlier, we do welcome your questions in chat as we go along. And if we say anything that you missed, please don't hesitate to ask. All right, Melissa, I will hand it to you.
Thank you, John. As John mentioned, so we'll start with the process for selecting, and there will be some things, but we've tried our best to not, even though we'll talk about some of the similar topics, to not necessarily repeat everything. But in this section, what I want to talk about is looking at the logistics of the selecting process. So the process for selecting materials to digitize will involve several considerations. And one of the things I wanted to note that's not on the slide, but is important, is to keep in mind the purpose, mission, and strategic directions of the organization or entity that you are involved with in considering, developing digital collections for. I will touch on a couple of things. The first thing I wanted to talk about in terms of selection process specifically is format and access to materials. In terms of access, some things to keep in mind are, if physical collections are located where patrons can access them, or items of a physical collection may be dispersed. Thinking through about conditions of restriction to access for materials, right? So if there's materials, for example, let's say that are in an offsite storage that would require having them sent over to where you are, where a patron can access it, then maybe that's a consideration for putting into digitization queue. Thinking through as well that digitization might also may not only be a way to preserve the materials, but also doesn't necessarily equate to it being accessible. And John will talk a little bit more about accessibility later on. In terms of access, though, as I mentioned before, storage concerns can also maybe impact decisions for selecting. And so considering again where materials are being held, how they're being stored, is there sufficient space in-house to store those, or is your space limited? And I feel like limited space is probably a thing we're all um, encountering in all of our collections and spaces. Maybe you want to give priority to an extensive collection of bound volumes, for example, that can be discarded so you can free up space. Alternatively, you might want to consider things like if materials are at risk, because of their condition, or maybe they're exposed to elements and you want to make sure that those environmental factors are also being considered. I know that here in Florida, as well as across the Caribbean, we all are impacted by hurricanes and just bad weather. And so keeping those things in mind, as well as storage, how things are being stored, and maybe giving those priority. Um, Also, amount of content should also be considered when you're going through the selection process. So thinking through early on in the planning process about how much content is actually available, because digitization is very time consuming, and you do often have other, priorities and things that come up. And so perhaps you want to maybe consider starting with a subset, a collection or a small sample that would be representative of a larger collection, right? And I have, for example, here a picture of our microfilm here at UF libraries, at the University of Florida libraries. In our Latin American and Caribbean collection, we have 50 cabinets of microfilm, and we can't digitize everything all at once. So having to be very selective in picking kind of representative samples to start small. But alternatively, might have a project that revolves around a larger number of materials, let's say like a 50-year run of a newspaper, right? And because you'd provide access to a complete run, maybe you want to give that priority. So thinking through these things very early on. So access to and storage of your materials, but also the quantity, so amount of content. Also thinking through format, because different formats are going to require different digitization needs. And so thinking through, is it text items that maybe are bound or loose leaf, that might require different scanning materials and OCR considerations, versus like photographs, and thinking through, are those black and white? Are they color? Are they grayscale? Having to kind of keep these things in mind, because they will impact, again, skills and equipment that you're going to need. Then also significance, and John will talk about this a little bit more too, so I won't talk on this too much, but the idea of materials of interest, do they maybe complement another collection that you already have, or that's in DLOC that might not be yours, but from another partner? Would you consider maybe digitizing materials that help kind of maybe highlight a hidden collection or bring to light an underrepresented perspective? So things to just keep in mind as you start to kind of begin the process. Next slide, please. Also wanted to touch on permissions and privacy. I know that DLOC is an open access platform and really does strive to take copyright permissions and privacy seriously. So we do highly recommend that you investigate copyright status of materials prior to the selection, and that can also be time consuming and a little complicated. So thinking through like, what will that process look like? Is it needed for the materials that you're considering? Maybe you give preference to materials that are in public domain. Maybe you have a good case for pushing to digitize collections that maybe are in copyright. And as has been mentioned previously, there is a copyright advisory board network that's being brought together through the Revitalizing DLOC grant. So there will be resources available that you can consult, and the team is also available to kind of help through that process. But permission and privacy are two different things too, right? So thinking through privacy, and really I try to kind of just boil that onto like consent to be able to digitize. So keeping in mind, if maybe a particular set of items or a collection would maybe violate privacy laws, trying to just follow a professional code of ethics and really trying to make sure that we are doing due diligence to include individuals and or communities that would be most impacted by these decisions, right? Like maybe you don't want to put up an oral history where someone's um, talking through like lived experiences because that might put them at risk in some degree to some degree. So from the very beginning, again, thinking through what this could look like. Next slide, please. Funding is also very important to think about because I think we all know this, but the money is really what helps us get all these collections digitized and allow us to really be able to do this work. So thinking through costs that would be associated with digitization projects, and I'm going to outline here a few examples of factors that you will want to consider when you're developing a project budget. And again, thinking through from the very beginning and that process, getting that planning going. You will definitely want to make sure that you're identifying your funding needs and funding sources. And John will talk a little bit more about funding sources later, so I won't touch on that now, but I will stick to highlighting three big factors, which would be your materials, your equipment, and your personnel. For materials, thinking through quantity, format, and condition, because as I mentioned earlier, that's going to impact um, equipment and process for digitization. um, and the cost is really going to vary a lot depending on the material, right? Like you can have loose leaf material, newspaper, for example, loose leaf material of newspapers that would be like highly and extremely more expensive than if you have newspaper content on microfilm. Microfilm's much cheaper to digitize from than paper, but paper usually gives us better quality and better output. So kind of having to keep these things in mind. For equipment, the same thing, having to think through format, size, and condition of the materials, because that's going to impact what equipment would be best to handle those needs. Thinking through, right, like maps are going to probably require large scale equipment versus maybe documents that maybe you can scan on a flatbed scanner or using a smaller camera. And then personnel, I would argue, is maybe the most important thing to consider, because you want to make sure that you can pay people to be on the staff to handle these issues and to really bring that expertise and skills. And so thinking through again from early on, like, do you have the skills on staff? The people on staff who have the skills you need to get this digitization done, would they maybe need training, would we have to pay for training? Are there enough people on the team to be able to handle the task? And also thinking through as well, maybe even outsourcing digitization for some cases. Next slide, please. Along with personnel, another thing I thought would be really important to stress is, and I kind of titled as additional resources, but thinking through like cataloging and metadata. And so thinking through, before you begin the actual digitization process, the catalog records and metadata for the materials you're going to be digitizing are in a good spot to be shared, right? So here we do a lot of our cataloging review prior to the digitization to make sure that any of the metadata that then will be applied to the items and ingested in DLOC is already taken care of from the beginning. We don't have to worry about retrospectively editing information. Catalog records, we double check to make sure that we can then share those publicly. So submitting to OCLC so that, they're easily findable by our patrons and users from all across the world, really trying to make our content as accessible and discoverable as possible. I know I'm a big believer of we're doing all this digitization work. We need to be putting it out there, right? It's not just the digitization, it's also the getting folks to then use the materials we're digitizing. And then again, metadata too. So having metadata that's descriptive, and I know Laura Perry gave a training on how to prepare metadata for ingest and DLOC, and last month I presented on Spanish language metadata, so I did want to mention that again. So I think it is important to be considering having multilingual metadata, especially when a lot of content from the Caribbean is non-English, and making sure that records and the information that's being input into DLOC is representative of the materials, and that then we're by increasing and adding metadata in languages other than English, we're not only helping to match the metadata language to the original language of the materials, but we're also helping our users who are non-English speakers more easily discover and be able to access and use the collections we're making available. And the screenshot here is just an example of one newspaper, for example, that we digitized in partnership with the University of Puerto Rico. It's a Spanish language newspaper. And so I just wanted to highlight so you can see an example of what Spanish metadata would look like for an item record. And with that, I will pass it off to John.
All right, thanks, Melissa. Selection criteria. There's lots of reasons to select objects for your digital collection. There's lots of reasons not to select objects. And so I'm going to go through several of these, and some of them Melissa has just touched on. I'm just going to, like I said, dive a little deeper. None of these are mutually exclusive. So, your sweet spot is really you're looking for materials that meet multiple criteria, because if you could satisfy various needs or goals with one material, one object, or one group of materials, great. Why not do that? So even though we've kind of separated these out, there's a lot of overlap between these criteria. The first thing is kind of an obvious thing, I would imagine, and that's just high demand. If you have objects that you have in your collection, if there's a great deal of demand for these, you're not only doing a great service for the users, for the researchers, but you're also probably saving your staff some pain and headaches by having these materials just digitized online, so you're not constantly pulling the same materials for patrons again and again. Demand can come in a number of different ways. It could be, research requests. It could be if you have people in classes, for example, who are coming to use your materials as part of class instruction. It can be demand from other institutions for, if you're doing exhibits or shared projects. Demand can be tracked in a lot of different ways. At the University of Florida, one of the ways we track demand is we'll frequently have selected materials we'll put in our digital collection, and then we'll see if people are using them or not. And then that will make us decide, okay, it looks like this is the kind of stuff people want, and that's an indicator that the demand is there. We also, of course, track our patron requests as people are requesting things to be retrieved from our archival collections, rare books, maps, whatever the case may be. We have a pretty good idea of what some of our trends are and high use areas. We have one example here from our Panama Canal collection, which, as I said earlier, I manage. The Panama American is a newspaper that is our most used title in our Panama and the Canal digital collection. The demand is there, and it's been there ever since we started putting materials relating to Panama and the Canal online. And so that has led us to prioritize digitizing more issues of the Panama American, as well as other newspapers and publications. Spotlighting underused materials. Melissa touched on this earlier, that frequently one of the real wonderful uses of digital collections is to put a spotlight on materials that, for whatever reason, they're not being used. It could be that these are new collections that you're just releasing to the public for the first time. It could be that these are materials that you as a collection manager have known for years that there's a great deal of research value or education value in these materials, but for whatever reason, people aren't coming to look for them. And so making them available in your digital collection allows you to put a spotlight on them, to make sure that people are aware and can they discover them. And then ideally, what we do frequently a lot of times is, let's say for an archival collection, you want, the collection has a lot of different uses. It covers a lot of topics, and maybe people are underusing portions of the collection and you're a little surprised by that. frequently we'll digitize materials from those underused portions of a collection and put them online, and then hopefully through serendipity or through diligence, a researcher will be able to discover those materials, and it leads them to the parts of the collection that maybe had been underused in the past. The same is true for print collections and maps, and you can always highlight different subjects and different objects that you have. In this example here, for example, the Braga Brothers collection here at the University of Florida is actually one of our frequently used archival collections relating to Cuban sugar, but it's a huge collection that covers a lot of ground, and there are actually large parts of this collections that we feel there's a lot more that researchers could do to tap this collection for wonderful information. So we will have, over the years, from time to time, we will select some things from the underused portions of the collection and put them online. Unique or rare materials. This is another one of those that might be a little bit of a no-brainer, in the sense that if you're the only institution that holds something, you're doing a great service to scholarship and education, research education, by making those materials available broadly. A lot of researchers, they can't get to your repository, travel expenses, time, all the other factors that come into play. So if you're the only person that holds something, you do a great service by making that available. And so you can prioritize those materials that are extremely rare and scarce or unique. There's lots of archival collections, for example, that you will have the one only of its kind object that exists, and it could be buried in a very large collection. I just used the Braga Brothers as an example. There are lots of unique documents in that collection. There's lots of unique photos. And just because of the sheer size of the collection, they could be buried to a certain extent. And we're the only place that people can find them. So whenever you prioritize unique and rare materials, it is a great service to researchers. The example I've included here is from the University of Miami. This is in DLOC. And this is a 1542 document from their collection of papers relating to laborers for Jamaica. This is one of those one-of-the-kind things that there's probably not a copy of this somewhere. Types and formats. So there's lots of reasons to select things. There's reasons not to select things. As Melissa was saying earlier, sometimes you're selecting things because, let's say there's high demand for photographs at your institution. That's the format that people want the most. That's an obvious conclusion as a collection manager, that maybe you should prioritize digitizing photographs for your digital collection. It could be that it's maps, or it could be it's rare books. So it could be that demand allows you to, focus on certain formats over others. It could also be that, do you have the capacity and the expertise to handle all of the formats you might want to put online? It's relatively easy. Most people have, it's a low threshold in terms of being able to scan a photograph. It gets a little more complicated if you have a rare book, from 1500s that's tightly bound, and maybe you don't have the equipment that can scan that without damaging the materials. I've included an example here from our architecture collection here at UF. This is a 3D object, and it was digitized with multiple images in the round, basically like a 360 view. If you have artifacts in your collection, you should consider, when you're selecting materials, can you represent them in the best way? Do you have the ability to do something like multiple photographs of an object from various views? That's not to say you can't select objects. You can always just provide a single view. But frequently, for three-dimensional objects, you would want to select things that you can digitize in the way that's going to be the most useful to the users. There are other types of formats that, I would put them in that category of why bother if you don't have the capacity or the expertise, don't even go down that road. So for example, maps, if you don't have scanning equipment, as Melissa was saying earlier, if you don't have the scanning equipment to physically image a map, you shouldn't be prioritizing those maps, at least for in-house. If you're doing the work yourself, there's other ways in which you can get work digitized with partners, that'd be great. But type and format often can be the thing that is it's a deal breaker oftentimes if you just physically can't do it properly. All right, preservation. This is a great example here from the National Library of Jamaica of a map of, I didn't put the date here, but it's an old map, let me say. And you can see that at one time it was folded. It was obviously folded. You can see where it has, the fragments have, there's a lot of loss of information in this map. You can see where the creases were, that there, there's loss of the object itself. And it looks like that this map has been preserved well and digitized. And this is, to me, a perfect example of how you can use digitization as a preservation solution. And this map is now not going to risk further damage by retrieving this for patrons to use each time it's requested. It has now been digitized, and I would imagine the National Library of Jamaica probably has this put away somewhere safely, and they allow their patrons to use the digital copy, and they don't pull out the physical copy unless it's absolutely necessary. There are lots. This isn't, to me, this is kind of an extreme example in the sense that this is so fragmented, and the loss of information is fairly significant. But there are lots of, it's a wide spectrum in terms of the types of preservation reasons that you might have for digitizing something. There are, rare books, as I mentioned earlier, that are, you would want to digitize them and make them available online so that you're not physically having to open them and put stress on spines of books, for example. There are archival collections that we have collections here at the University of Florida where these collections date from the 1700s, and the type of ink that was used in these handwritten letters is actually has eaten away at the paper over time. And so there is, each time these pages are used by patrons, there is the very real possibility that a page may just fall apart, that it's lost the integrity because of the very nature of the ink that was used in writing these handwritten documents. That's one of our collections. It's a high priority for digitization because of that reason. And another criteria you might have, and sometimes this is a criteria that you go looking for, and sometimes this is a criteria that comes to you whether you are looking for it or not. There's lots of people with opinions about what should be digitized and how they should be prioritized. That could be your administrators. It could be your resource allocators. Frequently, they have strong opinions on what should be digitized, and frequently they have a very good perspective. For example, your administrator might be involved in donor relations, and they want to show examples of certain types of materials that can be digitized, certain subjects. They might need to report to their own resource allocators. They might be reporting to governments or to administrative bodies, and they need examples to show of the work that you can do with your digital collection. So I'm not trying to be dismissive when I say sometimes administrators can come to you, with their opinions unsolicited. Oftentimes, there's a very good reason for that. But I think we all probably have had examples where people come to us wanting to prioritize something, and it's, you've got your own priorities. Most frequently, that happens with me with donors. Donors have a very specific, they cherish their materials that they're giving you. And so frequently donors will come to you and expect that the materials be digitized and in their way and in their time. And that's not reality. And so it's one of the wonderful things about our business is that we have a lot of stakeholders, and when those stakeholders have opinions, and sometimes those can lead to wonderful things, but it's also as part of navigating the waters of how we select what we digitize. It is one of those things where you should take it on board as one of many factors when you're making decisions about what to digitize. Another common criterion for selecting materials for digital collection is all of the other things we do relating to outreach, exhibits, community engagement. I shouldn't say anytime, but we have a policy here at UF that if we're doing something and we're going to be scanning it for a class, we're going to be scanning it for some kind of outreach activity, we have a public event and we're going to make a sign or something. If we're scanning it, we might as well go ahead and scan it to be included in our digital collections. And frequently, if we're using something once, you're going to come back and use it again. There's a strong likelihood of that, particularly like when you're working with classes, for example, or if you're exhibiting something that's particularly special. You could easily see that you're going to use it again. So I won't say it's 100% of the time, but a large majority of the time, if we're scanning for any one of these reasons, we're putting it in our digital collection, assuming we have the permissions and rights to be able to do that. The example I've included here is we have some Cuban photographs, and we have an online exhibit called the Cuban American Timeline that one of our colleagues curated. And when she selected one of these photographs to be included in her online exhibit, we digitized the entire photograph album, and it's online. And so it's where one activity such as outreach and exhibits leads to high prioritization for digitization. We also, and I think you'll hear more about this if you attend the exhibits workshop that Kat plugged earlier relating to exhibits that our colleague Lourdes Santamaria Wheeler will be doing. With our exhibits program, we have a 100% digitization policy. If we can put it online, if we're digitizing it for an exhibit, we're putting it online. So to me, that has been one of the best changes we've had in the last 15 years or so, where we just are automatically including all exhibit materials in our digital collection, as well as the labels that go with them. I don't want to steal Lourdes's thunder, so I'll stop talking about that. Pilot projects, grant projects. This is something where I have a lot of expertise in this. I've done this a lot. If you have something you want to digitize and you need to get the resources to do it, or convince an administrator or resource allocator that, yeah, I should be able to do this, one of the easiest things to do is just to have a small pilot project or some kind of planning grant, for example, where you can digitize a portion of a larger whole. You can say, I want to digitize a bunch of newspapers or maps. I'm going to do just a few so that I can get some information about how much time it takes, and that we have the expertise to do it, and we have the capacity to do it in terms of equipment. And so frequently, this is a good criteria for selecting materials. You don't have to select everything. When we digitized from the Braga Brothers collection here at UF, we didn't digitize the entire collection. It's huge, for one thing. But we did select a small portion of the more used materials, did that first, and then we have continued to expand on that as we have gone. And we have several grant projects where we've gotten a smaller grant, frequently an internal grant, or just special funding allocated to us to do some very small, specific, limited project. And then we have used that as a foundation to go out and seek a larger pot of money to continue to do the rest of the project. Finally, bringing it home here, we'll finish with a few other considerations in addition to the selection criteria. And these kind of overlay and play with a lot of the selection criteria. When you're looking at the selection criteria, you should be thinking about these, I guess is the better way to say it. Accessibility. It's very important that what you are providing access to digitally is accessible in the broadest possible way. Certainly, just getting something digitized online, that's a win. Don't get me wrong, that's a good result. But the ideal, the best practice is you want to make whatever you're providing online as accessible as possible. one example of that, as Melissa mentioned earlier, is in terms of language. You don't want to have a barrier in terms of language. So if you have something that you can put up in online with both English and Spanish or English and French or whatever the languages may be, if you can have metadata for that, even minimal metadata, so that at least it's just one more means of discovery and access, that's fantastic. You should always keep in mind when you're selecting materials like audiovisual materials, for example, that for AV, if you have somebody who has a hearing impairment, they may not be able to hear the audio or video recording that you are putting in your digital collection. And therefore, you should, as part of your selection process, you should be thinking about how you can accommodate those users with captioning or with transcripts, or at least a more in-depth summary at a bare minimum, so that somebody who does have some kind of barrier like that would still be able to get an idea of what the content is. I'm sure I can give other examples, but I think the main thing here is that always think about how the materials are going to be used when you're going through the selection process and you're looking at these criteria. We always try and have the user in mind, and we're more and more, we are trying to expand our breadth of access in what we do. I think I'll say full stop there, and I will hand it back to Melissa.
Thanks, John. Something else that we've talked about a lot internally that we're trying to do here too, and that we know is something that other libraries and other cultural heritage institutions have been doing a lot, especially in recent years, is considering harmful language and implementing some sort of offensive, harmful language statement, especially when we're thinking about our historical collections. Thinking about, I know, um, historic primary resources and other things like that that might relate or mention things like race, ethnicity, religion, gender, etc. Um, it's going to be really important to think through things about like how language changes over time, how offensive and discriminatory language maybe is not representative of your institutional beliefs or your own personal beliefs. But I think it's important to kind of bring this up and to talk through this, because especially when we're thinking of historical materials that really do have this type of language included in the materials, acknowledging that and being mindful of that, especially for, again, like John was pointing out, like thinking of your users, that historic terminology, acknowledging that it is offensive and harmful, but also needing to be aware of it and knowing what it is, because again, with historical materials, especially if folks are coming in to use the material, you're really going to get the most fruitful results using that language. And so just kind of bearing that in mind, and again, thinking through best ways that as an institution or an entity that you can kind of address that these are concerns in collections. So with that, I think that we are done and we can open up for questions. I know John and I prepared some questions, but we want to make sure that we give you all a chance to ask us questions first. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or unmute. We're open.